There it is. Fantastic. So, as I said, thank you all for joining me. Welcome back to our ADSY revision sessions. So we're going to pick off, like I said, where we concluded the previous session where we started to have a look at task 4. Now, this is arguably the big written part of the level 3 synoptic. And these are often the areas that we generally see the weakest performance from students in. When I use that term weakest performance, it doesn't mean that students are doing it poorly. It just means in comparison to other areas, this is generally where less marks again. More often than not, we find with these written questions, the big issue that we see with learners, it's not the ability to write. It's actually that when you read the question and then you read the answer, they haven't really answered it. You can write 10 paragraphs of fantastic information, but if you haven't answered the question, the AAT marker is going to go, no, and he's going to move on. It's about, we just had this discussion about this last week. We looked at, again, like the quality of the information. One paragraph of correct information is infinitely more valuable in the eyes of the marker than 5 paragraphs of waffle. And we saw, didn't we, there was a pattern with these sort of questions. We looked at, like, you generally did a bit of role playing. You would put into a scenario, you are an accountant at this company, you work for this client, and then there would be something happens, an event that sets off the question. You are asked to do this. Somebody comes to you and asks you about that. And then from there, we just have to appropriate a response just sort of based on what that event is. Now, we looked at certain things, didn't we, like the subtleties in the questions. More often than not, again, it's not that people don't have the ability to write. It's just that they're simply just going down the wrong lane. They're not actually really writing about what the question's asking. And we looked at things, again, like looking at potential. In this example, which was part A of task 4, we looked at like consequences, situations, little things like that. We said, didn't we? It's asking for situations, not a situation. Sounds really, really obvious, and I don't want to sound like I'm telling anybody how to suck eggs, but if it's saying situations, I need more than one example, don't I? It was little things like that that we started to pick up on, and we are going to continue that now by moving on in task 4, having a look at the next section, which is covering part B. So this just span over 2 pages. Let me just read the scenario out, and again, we'll pick out this information. So we're saying that Devilish Co. work with a number of different clients, from a small trader retail business to large manufacturing organizations to building companies and many other types of businesses and industries. Anybody and everybody by the sounds of it. As an accountant, the practice will hold personal data on clients. Now, again, just a couple of things we can very quickly pick out here. Right from the start, you see you're given essentially the role. Now, again, with these questions, more often than not, the role is the same. So if you work at Devilish Co., all these questions might be asking different things, but again, the role is the same. They don't normally put you in a different scenario for every single question on one task. So again, this one, a bit of a role, the background of the company, this is the sort of thing they do. But immediately it's saying, okay, picking out key things, different clients, sole traders, large manufacturing, building companies, many other types of businesses and industries. Now, what does that mean at face value? Not a lot. What that could mean, again, is it might not be in this question specifically, but you should be looking at this type of information and just saying, okay, well, why do I need to know this? What is likely to come up? The first thing that springs to mind to me is it's pointing out sole traders, large companies. One question that the AAT like to use is having you discuss the differences between sole traders, partnerships, limited companies. What are the benefits or drawbacks or just the different rules and legislation that these different entities have to follow? That might be something that comes up here, possibly because it's making a point of saying sole traders. It might not, and there's no guarantee it's going to come up, but that's the sort of thing you can start to pick out with this information. And then, of course, as an accountant, we hold personal data. Now, that in this instance is what we generally regard as the event. So when we use the term event, it doesn't always mean that something has to happen. It's not okay, somebody sends you an email or somebody comes barging into your office. The event could just be just what happens at the business. So the event here is this company, Devilish Co., holds a lot of personal data. We're dealing with a multitude of clients. We hold personal data relating to all those clients. So now we know that, let's have a look at what the question's actually asking us. And it's saying here, can we explain whether confidentiality is a legal requirement, an ethical requirement, or both? and we've got 2 marks available. Now, with a question like this, picking through it, not too bad, is it? It doesn't look very long-winded. It's saying, okay, let's just, again, filter through. So I'm looking at confidentiality. Now, I'm assuming we all know what that means, but just in case, when we talk about confidentiality, just think confidential. It's the handling of personal data, be it ours, the companies, customers. All that information is personal, it's private, it needs to be kept confidential. How we do that, various different things, which, to be fair, this question isn't really focusing on. But what it's saying here is when we talk about confidentiality as a concept, what is it? Why do we do it? Is it a legal requirement? Is it an ethical requirement? Or is it, in fact, both? So let me just throw that out to the group. What do you think it is? Do you think it's a legal requirement, an ethical one, or both? So again, let's just see what you guys think, and then of course we'll have a look ourselves. So very quickly looking at chat box, both seems to be the general consensus. It stands to reason, doesn't it? It's almost like it's poking you in the ribs a little bit, saying, is it this, or what about both of them? It is both, isn't it? So there's 2 different sides to this. So when you're constructing a question like this, again, there's no bread and butter template answer that you need to follow. That's one of the things with the written questions that we started to touch on last week, didn't we? Providing you get your points across, you've got the marks. It's not about you need to write it in a certain way and use certain sentences. Providing what you actually provide is accurate, legible, and correct, the AAT marker will give you the marks for it. So we can essentially say that, yeah, it's both, isn't it? It's a legal and an ethical requirement. Now, to me, this is where I need to look at the marks available. Now, there's only 2 for this. Now, if I just write both, or it is both a legal and an ethical requirement, again, ask yourself the question, have I done enough there to warrant both marks? Arguably not. Sometimes with questions like this, you're going to get a mark for, of course, giving the correct option, but let's also offer a bit of context to the reader. I can say it's both. Now, again, just play this in like a real life scenario. If somebody's asking you this question and you say, oh, it's both, and then don't say anything else, the response you're pretty likely to get is, okay, why? Why is it both? I don't understand that. Offer a bit of context. So I'd say, okay, we've got 1 mark here. Now, of course, I'm just writing mine shorthand. Don't put both exclamation mark. You could just put, it is both a legal and an ethical requirement. You know, I'm just keeping it short for the purposes of what we're doing here. Now, let's describe why. Now, we can split this into 2 different ones, can't we? If we're looking at a legal requirement, offer an example of this. So if again, let me pitch this to the group. If I asked you guys, think of a law or some form of government legislation about handling personal data. Now, there's 2 that pop up. One is the old act, and there's also the new one, which is pretty relevant. I think we were all sick of hearing about it over the last couple of years when it was all up and running. So we've got a couple of different ones up there, which is fine. So the 2 that I was just sort of referring to have come up. We have the Data Protection Act. The Data Protection Act was essentially superseded by a new act, wasn't it? GDPR. So GDPR is something that, again, over the last, I don't know, 5 or 6 years perhaps, has been painstakingly expressed in almost everyday life, hasn't it? GDPR, alongside data protection, is legal legislation. It is a legal requirement. Companies have to follow data protection laws. They have to follow GDPR. You might remember that, you know, when all this started, you'd have just got tons and tons of emails from all these companies that you've had interactions with over, you know, the lifespan of using the internet. You might have bought some clothes off a clothing store or something off Amazon or whatever. They basically had to re-ask for your consent, didn't they, to adhere to the laws. So legal requirement, such as GDPR. Now, again, if you used data protection, again, you wouldn't be penalised for that. It might be the older form of the legislation, but it's still technically correct. It is an example of the legal requirement. Okay. We've also said it's an ethical requirement, didn't we? So now we need to express why. So now, as a rule of thumb, if we're looking at anything ethics related, what are you? You are an AAT student, aren't you? So anything ethics related, try and relay it more directly. Now, GDPR is, again, it's legislation, it was law, it affected every company in every sector, in every walk of life. Ethical requirements in this instance doesn't, it's more specific to the AAT. Now, again, let me throw the question out to the group. This is a bit of a trickier one. I won't say tricky, it might be selling people short there. How is this an ethical requirement? So do the AAT have anything in place, rules, principles perhaps, that give us an idea of how to behave ethically? Now, Bradley is absolutely right there, well done. The AAT's code of ethics essentially revolves around fundamental principles, doesn't it? Very nice work. So what we're saying there is the ethical side of it. Again, as members, you as student members have to adhere to the AAT's code of ethics. Those are what they call, of course, their fundamental principles. It's not a set of pre-prescribed rules, is it? It's it's almost like a mantra that you should follow, and just some tools that you can use to avoid potentially dangerous situations for your own integrity. So what we're saying there is an ethical requirement because we are AAT members. We have to adhere to the AAT's fundamental principles. Now, I'm not going to go through those principles word for word because we'd probably need another 2 or 3 hours to do that. But within that, there is, of course, just how we handle confidential information. Again, there's a lot of trust placed in us. We are in pretty unique positions as accountants, aren't we? Be it if you work in industry or if you work in practice dealing with other clients. We see a lot, don't we? A lot more than pretty much everybody else in the company. We see bank balances, money coming in, money coming out. The same can be said for our clients. We see their outlays. It's really sensitive information. It's important that we understand, just how to handle that information. Okay, Joanna's asking, do we get access to the AAT code of practice in the exam? The fundamental principles, I believe there is an excerpt available. More often than not, they just sort of say, what principle is at threat? Integrity, honesty, objectivity. I'd advise you just to get clued up with your key principles for the most part. And we've got on the AAT practice synoptics, they give you the fundamental principles. Yeah, well, there you go. That's just reframing what I just said. So, of course, you do have that little sidebar in the exam available to you. I would say just do read it beforehand. I don't feel like I'm stating the obvious. Don't elect to ignore it up until your exam. You can just get a gist of it. You don't need to know it word for word, but understanding what it's about before you go into the exam is pretty important. Okay. Part C, we're now saying, okay, let's state 3 people/bodies that it would be relevant to disclose confidential information to. So again, this is one of those quite open-ended questions because in reality, there are more than 3 that we could use, but providing the examples that we give are correct, again, you'll pick up 3 marks. Now, as far as how marks are allocated here, I think it's pretty obvious, isn't it? I've got 1, 2, 3. I've got 3 marks available. So again, let me pitch this one out to the group. What examples can you think of? Now, again, you might find your answer is different than other people's. You might find that somebody's put something you wouldn't have thought of. That's fine. Providing they are correct, like I said, you wouldn't lose marks. So let's have a look. Now, is there any popular ones that are coming out here? Okay. National Crime Agency, I can see that one popping up. So let me write that in. That's a very good example. So National Crime Agency. Or the NCA, as we may also refer to them as. Now, again, this is a little side note, actually. If you're writing anything that uses abbreviations, other than HMRC, write out what it is before you start using abbreviations. So if this was like a longer-winded question, write out National Crime Agency and then use NCA if you need to refer to it afterwards, okay? Again, just in case, assume the reader doesn't know what it stands for. What other ones have we got? I can see police is on there a couple of times. I think it's a good example. Let's put that in. Often raises a couple of eyebrows out because people say, well, hang on a minute, isn't the National Crime Agency the same as the police? No, there is, of course, likely to be some interdependent work done between the two bodies. The National Crime Agency is its own body, though. It isn't a subdivision of the police. Okay, so the police would be another example. A couple of other ones I can see on there that are really, really good. So I'm going to use Lather's example. I'm going to put HMRC. But the important one with this is I need consent. And that's why I want to use that example. If the police come knocking on the door or we get inquiry from the National Crime Agency, I'm not going to say, hang on a minute, let me just ring the client up and check I can send over all this information. You're going to comply with them, aren't you? With HMRC, more often than not, if we're sharing that information, we need the customer's consent. That consent needs to be written as well. You do sometimes get questions about this. Consent over the phone or in a face-to-face conversation isn't good enough. You need written proof that somebody has given you consent, okay? Another example, I know we've only got 3 on here, but I know one that everybody else has put as well, quite a popular one, is professional bodies. So like the AAT are a professional body, as are ACCA, so on and so forth. Again, that would be a fine example. Just because I haven't put it here doesn't mean you are wrong. You could swap one of these out and put professional bodies, brackets AAT, in one of these, and you'd have still got the marks, okay? Very nice work, everybody. Okay, part D. We've been asked by a client for some help in understanding their financial statements and also some clarification of terminology that they have heard discussed amongst their accountant friends. Okay, so in this one, we have the role, don't we? The event, excuse me. There's no real role going on here because this isn't a continuation of what we've just covered. But we're just changing lanes here, aren't we? Again, something else has happened now. I said, okay, so we need to write a memo and I need to explain what the statement of profit and loss is and what the statement of financial position is and what sort of things they include. And then the meaning of the following terms, which is materiality and going concern. Okay, so we need to do quite a bit here, don't we? And I've actually only really got 4 marks available. It's a lot of work, isn't it, for what you could argue isn't an awful lot of marks. But again, I think we'll be okay with this. So let's go down and start writing this in. So the date, if you're asked to put it in, I must admit, sometimes this is already filled in. The subject, again, just as is appropriate. We could just put response to queries. Now, again, providing what you've put is somewhat relevant, that is absolutely fine. So in the first bit, it's saying, okay, I need to talk about the P&L, the statement of financial position, and give an example of what can go in those. So let's start with the P&L. Now, again, there is no correct description. You do not need to adhere to a certain pattern. As long as what you describe is correct, you would be fine. When you're discussing the P&L, there's 2 key pieces of terminology that we should focus on here. So without going into dirty details of all the different things that end up on a P&L, there's 2 very distinct categories, isn't there? Before I start blurting out the answer, can anybody tell me what they think they are? What does a P&L show? Well done, Anne. Excellent work, everybody. You're absolutely right. It shows income and expenses, doesn't it? Let's write that in. Super work. Now, again, you could put it shows income and expenditure. And is that enough? You could maybe go a bit further. So I'll just say over a period of time. So why have I said period of time and not a year? Now, again, you'll notice I'm not really going into massive detail here. I'm keeping this relatively short just for the purposes of what we're doing. But the reason I'm not saying a year is because, yes, we have annual accounts where we'll have an annual profit and loss, but you will know just by working in companies, most companies will do this frequently. They'll want to know the profit and loss for the month, for the quarter, for the half of the year. So because of that, I could just say a P&L shows income and expenses over a period of time. What that period is Doesn't really matter, does it? It might be an annual one, but a company might be doing it monthly. It really doesn't matter. Now, there's one other thing that I think we need to really point out here, isn't there? Of course, it sounds pretty obvious. I'm showing income and expenses. This is a statement of profit and loss. So essentially, it's going to show what? Profit. Yeah, well done, everybody. So it shows profit and loss over that period. Now, you might be sat there saying, well, isn't that painstakingly obvious? If I'm talking about a statement of profit or a loss, surely it's clear that it shows profit or loss. Take this at face value. The rule that I like to give people is assume that whoever you are writing this to knows diddly squat about anything. Don't write like they're an idiot, but basically give them everything that they need to know. It sounds obvious to us because we've got a relative understanding of it, but just tell them, assume they know nothing about this statement. Okay. Now, that's fine, but the question, and again, this is where people trip up. If I just scroll back up, it's saying, okay, can we show what they each include? Now, we've kind of already done that, haven't we? So this is where, again, you can sort of trip yourself up a little bit. In terms of what they can include, there's a couple of different ways you can go about this. We have already said it includes, just by our writing, it includes income, expenses, it shows profit and loss. That is arguably enough in my mind. I think a marker would be happy with that. You can offer certain specifics. So when I say specific examples, you might say like, I don't know, obviously sales, purchases, etc. So you can offer an example of a couple of different things that go in a P&L. The only reason you've got to be careful doing that is, again, assume you're writing this to somebody that doesn't know what any of this is. They might not understand that other things can appear in there. There's nothing wrong with offering an example, but again, just be careful about how you write it. It should be something along the lines of, this includes transactions such as, and that just implies, doesn't it, that these are, sales and purchases are not the only thing that are on a profit and loss. Again, sounds obvious, but it's just about the detail in your writing. Okay, I think we're happy with that one. Let's have a look at the SOFP. Now, the statement of financial position, obviously, without sounding blatantly obvious again, let's just apply some consistency here. We said the P&L shows income and expenses. So let me pitch the same question to the group again. What does an SOFP show? What does a statement of financial position show me? And again, if you are, I was just about to say if you are struggling, but I can tell by the group's responses that we seem to be okay. If you want 100% sure, you can use the mnemonic dead click. We've already covered expenses and assets, haven't we? Yeah, assets and liabilities. So it shows our assets and liabilities, again, at a specific point in time. Now, again, this is where we can start to differentiate our writing a little bit. Notice that when I've put with the P&L over a period of time, with the statement of financial position, I've said at a point in time. Now, the reason for that is because, as we've already touched on, a P&L looks at expenditure and income over a month. The statement of financial position, as you will probably be familiar with, doesn't work that way. It doesn't look at what's happened in the month. It shows us where we are. We can do a statement of financial position at the end of the month, but it only shows us where we are at that point. It doesn't show us everything that's necessarily happened. We could find that information if we really wanted to, but it's more saying, okay, today, now, this is where we are at. That's what it's focusing on a little bit more. So again, just little changes to your questions like that really adds quality to the work. And it also shows the amounts that we owe to the owners of the business. oh, excuse me, my pen's just had a quick nap. There we go. Which of course we know is capital. Now, this is always an interesting point. I have been asked this before where people say, well, what if it's a limited company? Because at that point, the owners or the difference is the shareholders of the business primarily, isn't it? Now, of course, you guys aren't working on financial statements of limited companies, okay? So I would say if you are writing anything about things like this, such as the P&L and the SOFP, do it based on what you've covered at this level. Don't overextend yourself and start talking about issues of shares and dividends and so on and so forth. You haven't covered that in the syllabus. It's not really what you need to be writing about. Trust me, when you get to level 4, you'll have plenty of time to worry about limited company statements, okay? So we've shown assets and liabilities, we've shown amounts owed to the owners. Now, again, you can offer examples if you wish. I don't think you would be in a detrimental position if you didn't, but if you wished to, we certainly could. So again, we can offer specific examples. We could say, okay, buildings owned. And bank loans or something like that. You could get just a couple of examples, but again, if you do wish to do something like that, please make it abundantly clear that these are some possibilities, not the only things that appear on these statements, okay? So what we've done there is we've done the following, haven't we? Description, and an example. That would be enough to pick you up the 2 marks available here, 1 for each. So again, quite a bit of legwork to do for a couple of marks, isn't there? Okay, let's just remind ourselves what the second part of this question is looking at. Can we have a discussion about the meaning of the following terms? So what does materiality mean and what does going concern mean? So let's make some space for these. So let's start with materiality. Now, again, there's a mark available for each of these. Now, it doesn't need to be word for word as per the model answers. But again, I think this is a tricky one, isn't it? I think going concerns the easier out of the two. So I'm going to be nasty and ask you guys about this one. Does anybody want to hazard a guess at what they would describe materiality as? Let you guys have a think about it, shall I? It's a tricky one, isn't it? Like I said, going concerns arguably the easier of the two. But I'll keep you on your toes, shall we say. So when we talk about materiality, we're looking at financial statements, aren't we? And there's a certain sort of phrase that we are focusing on. And if you can hit those specific words, you've arguably got the marks here. So we're saying that the statements must show, or it must be, and this is the important bit. So, excuse me, should show a fair and true view. That's the concept of materiality, isn't it? The statements that we produce should be fair and true. Now, what that means is these need to be materially correct. So there's a difference between accurate and correct. That sounds a bit confusing, doesn't it? But what we're saying by that is that, okay, mistakes happen. There might be a mistake in the financial statements, but it's true, it's fair. It isn't a legitimate mistake. Sorry, it's not a purposefully made error. What we have done is just a mistake. So this could be something like an omission. So when we talk about this, again, it's these, it's not good, is it? So things like that, so missing information, and this is important, it can influence future decision making. So what we're saying is the statements have to be fair and true. In terms of what is on them, we have to make sure that any information that needs to be there is there and it is represented in a fair way, because if it isn't, it can essentially influence the decisions a company or a potential investor in the company makes. And then the last one is going concern. Now, this is arguably the one that you'll be a bit more familiar with, because we are introduced to this pretty much from the get-go at Advanced Bookkeeping, aren't we? We look at the accruals concept and the going concern concept. So the going concern one is essentially the assumption that the business is essentially going to be here for the future period, for an extended period of time, I should say. So what do we mean when we use that example? So when we're sat there, we're saying they're going to be there in the future. Now, I can appreciate that, okay, companies do go bust. It happens, doesn't it? But we're saying here, when we are trying to make decisions, when we are making, you know, perhaps pretty substantial ones, or when we're looking at the way we value things and just the overall outlay of the company, we do it with an anticipation that this time next year, the company is still going to exist. Now, generally, this is expressed as a 12-month period. So we say that, okay, any statements we produce, all the information on there, or just any decisions made are done under the assumption we will still be here in 12 months' time. Okay, so 12-month period is pretty standard. And again, just be sure to mention that in there. So this is, you know, just offering just a bit, it's almost like it ties in with sustainability a little bit. We want to operate in a way that sustains the business. Now, if you want to give an example of this, it's again, if we got really, really close to the end of a period and we were close to hitting our sales targets and the boss said, slap a discount on, get rid of absolutely everything in the warehouse and get it all out. I want our figures for this year to look as good as possible because I've got some investors coming in the new year. In the short term, it's fine. But what happens when you get to the start of the new year and you have nothing, you have no inventory in stock, you don't have any cash to pay your suppliers because you've given all this out on really generous credit terms to try and entice your customers to come in. Just little things like that. We need to operate with a sustainable mindset, don't we? So again, covering those couple of points like that would be enough to pick you up the relevant mark here, okay? I believe that has done task 4. Fantastic. Okay, so we are going to have a look at task 5. What time are we on now? We're going to be running for the next another 10 or 15 minutes. So we are going to start to have a look at this. We may not finish it, I'll be honest, but we'll have a look. Now, I like these tasks. I'm a bit sad, I must admit. I actually just finished taking the level 3 costings live sessions. So we'll be doing a lot of work on these. So task 5 is looking at apportionment, allocation, and any reapportionment of overheads. Again, this is one that we like to use because it's a chunky question. You should be, of course, pretty familiar with it at this stage, but there's a lot to these questions, isn't there? In terms of volume, not necessarily in terms of difficulty. You've done harder things in different units. So in this question, we're saying that Gemini Limited has the following information available for its 2 profit centers and a support center, or what we might also refer to as a service center. Now, if you aren't familiar with the differences between the two, we essentially say a cost center, a support center, a service center. They facilitate a service to the rest of the group. So again, the example the AAT like to use is the canteen. So the canteen that feeds the people on the production line. They love I don't know why the AAT love the canteen example, but it's that sort of logic. So we've got some different figures here. We've got budgeted overhead figures for depreciation, machine running costs, rent and rate of the premises, light, heat and power. And then I've also got some specific indirect labour costs for the cutting, stitching and stores departments, which comes to a total of 35,000. And then given some additional information. So I'm told that, okay, I have the carrying value of my machinery, I have the number of hours each of these machines has been running, and the overall square meterage, aka floor space, that each of these departments takes up in the warehouse. Now, again, with questions like this, you will probably be familiar with them at this point, but just to really reiterate the point, this information is given to you, okay? So you will be told the overhead figures, you will be told this additional information because, excuse me, because we need it, essentially. And it's saying that we're going to allocate overheads or apportion them on the most appropriate basis. So the total overheads for the support department cost centers are then going to be reapportioned. We will get into that in a little bit. Now, there's two different ways of reapportioning, isn't there? There's what we call the direct method and then the step down method. Just to reconfirm what they are in case anybody's forgot since they did costings, the direct method is where I have a service center that only services production lines, so actual cost centers. So again, if the canteen only fed staff from the cutting or stitching department, I would use the direct method. The step down method is what happens when a service center actually services another service center. Sounds really confusing, but again, just to use the example of the canteen, it would be like the maintenance staff eating in the canteen. So the maintenance staff, that team are themselves a service center, aren't they? Now, in this example, looks like we're going to be using the direct. We don't need to put anything into a different service center because we've only got one available to us, which is, just double checking, it actually tells what it is in this question. Stores. Oh, of course, it's the stores department, excuse me. So there's just one service department, which is stores. So it isn't servicing anything else. So I can use the direct method here, okay? Let's have a look. Now, I do have to go up and down. I don't like doing it in questions. I can appreciate it can be a bit disjointing for people, but I will have to just scroll up and down a little bit as we're going through these, if that's okay. So it's saying that use the following table to allocate or apportion overheads using the most appropriate basis. Okay, let's have a look. So let's start with depreciation for machinery. So the first thing I always need to focus on is the basis. What do I need to do? Am I going to allocate this directly to something, or do I need to apportion this? So first of all, again, before I start blurting out answers, what do you think I need to do? Is this a cost I can allocate directly, or am I going to have to do some apportionment here? What do we think? Yeah, well done, Holly. I need to apportion. I need to find out what for. So this is where, if you need to apportion something, the additional information you are provided with comes in very handy. The carrying value of machinery would arguably be a good thing to apportion depreciation charges off. So let me write that in. So I'm going to apportion based on inventory value. I'm not graced with space, so I'm going to have to write shorthand a little bit. Now, the good thing is with these is when you're reapportioning, it doesn't really matter what basis you're doing that on. The maths, or the formula, I should say, essentially stays the same. So what we're saying here is the formula I'm going to use is my cost. It's going to be divided by the total of the range of information. So when I've got this additional information here, it's the grand total of it. So the total value of whatever I'm picking. So in the additional information, and then times by the amount for the specific department. Looks a bit long-winded, but it's really not that bad, I promise you. So first of all, we're saying, okay, what is my depreciation amount? £100,000. Okay, so let me, first of all, put that in. Total, 100,000. I can put that in now because it needs to come to that amount. So all I'm going to do is total cost, £100,000, divided by the total value of my chosen basis. So the basis for this one, I've said I'm going to use the carrying value of the machinery. The grand total of that comes to £1 million. Times by the value of the specific department. So let's start with cutting. So I'm saying for cutting, it's actually 650,000. So by doing that, I get a cost, well done Beverly, £65,000. Let me put that in. So my cutting department is going to take £65,000. Now, the good thing is with a question like this, again, if I'm doing more than one, the first bit of the formula is literally going to stay the same. I'm not going to fiddle with the cost. I'm not going to fiddle with the total based on the basis that I've chosen. The only thing I need to change is now I'm doing a different department. So I'm now going to look at the stitching department, which was 350,000. To do the exact same, 100,000 divided by 1 million times by 350,000 gives me a total of £35,000. Super. And I can very quickly see, can't I, that adding those two up comes back to my 100,000. Now, some people will just say, okay, well, I'll work out the difference between the two. So if I need to know, for example, the value of stitching, I've already worked out the value of cutting, I'll just work out the difference. That saves a lot of time, and it is correct, providing your first actual calculation was correct. I would always recommend just very quickly put the formula in. It's very easy to make mistakes. Just be sensible with it. It takes 2 seconds to punch it in the calculator, and you will identify that, hang on a minute, well, my totals don't add up actually. You've identified the error. You've saved yourself a bit of a headache. Okay, next one, let's have a look. Variable machine running costs. So the first thing I need to do is work out, am I going to allocate this or apportion it? So again, let me show the information that I've got available to me. So I'm now focusing on my variable machine running costs of £50,000. So again, let me ask the group, what do you think I need to do with that cost? Do I need to allocate it based on something, or am I going to apportion based on the additional information provided to me here? Yeah, very nice work, everybody. It's a variable machine cost, so it stands to reason that I'm going to apportion that. And what am I going to apportion it on? Let's use machine hours. Okay, I do apologize, I'm not graced with space. Okay, now again, let me just bring that total down. Easy peasy. Okay, so now let's work out this. So we've just said again, let's do the first one together. Cost, £50,000 divided by the total value of my selected basis. So I've just selected machine hours as the most appropriate basis, haven't I? So my total is 5,000 hours. So divided by 5,000 and then simply times by the value of the department I'm working on. So again, I'll start with the cutting department. I'm going to times by 4,000. So times by 4,000 hours, giving me a total of £40,000. Let me put that in. Super. Okay. Now again, the first half of the formula just remains completely unchanged. The only difference is now the value of the department. I'm looking at the stitching department now, which based on the information the question has provided me with, comes to 1,000 hours. So can anybody punch that into the calculator? Please tell me what you come out with. Excellent. Thank you, Beverly. Thank you, Joanne. £10,000. So 500,000 divided by 5,000 times by the 1,000. £10,000. I can quickly check, okay, does this come to the total that I've got here? Yes, it does, 50,000. Brilliant, we're nearly there. Let's finish this first half off before we wrap up, shall we? We're not that far away. Okay, rent and rates of the premises. Again, first question. I'm now looking at the £40,000 for my rent and rates. So do I need to allocate this or am I going to apportion it? And if I am, what am I going to base that apportionment off? Yeah, well done, everybody. It's floor space, isn't it? So I'm going to apportion based off floor space. Okay, let's do that. So we've just said this total came to 40,000. So I'm just going to put that in now. And again, just do the exact same. I'm not graced with space. I'm going to have to cram this in a little bit. Total cost divided by the total value of my chosen apportionment. So the basis I've selected is floor space. So total, very kindly provided, 40,000. Times by the amount for the respective department. Now, again, I'm going to start with cutting. So that's 140,000 square meters, as is given to me in the question. Anyway, tell me what that comes to, please. Thank you, Joanne. Already on it. Great work. So I do apologize because I've written 40,000 there and not 400. Let me just change that very quickly. Excellent work, everybody. It comes to 14,000. Let me put that in. Okay, same again. My cost doesn't need to change. So that first bit of the formula, again, I'm not interested in messing with that. The only thing I'm interested in now is just the new amount. So times by the value of the department. So the stitching department is 100,000 square meters. So again, the first part of your formula remains unchanged. I'm now just going to do times by 100,000, which is Bev has put in the chat, gives me a total of £10,000. Okay, let me put that in. Okay, now, as I look at that, immediately I say, well, hang on a minute, that isn't coming to my total, is it? I'm very clearly short. I'm about £16,000 short of where I need to be here. So does that mean I've made a mistake? Am I missing something here? Well spotted, Joanne. See if everybody else agrees with you. Don't panic if your numbers immediately don't add up. If I'm apportioning and reapportioning, it stands to reason that some costs are going to end up in the service centre. Based on the additional information given to me, the stores department is also taking up some space in the warehouse, isn't it? So I also need to apportion some of that cost. Now, again, it'll be the exact same. 40,000 divided by the 400,000. And this time I'm simply going to multiply by the square meterage of said storage department, 160,000 square meters. Gives me a total of 16,000. Let's put that in. Now at this point, yes, everything works out as is intended. We've then got light, heat and power for the premises. Now this is always an interesting one. If you are given floor space, it normally relates to rent and just sort of rent and rates. Sometimes they give you the volume of the area. So for heating, for example, it sometimes gives you the area of each one, not just the floor space or the volume of the area, which makes sense, doesn't it? Because the bigger the area, the more energy is going to be used to heat it. If you aren't given that, then use floor space. Okay, so on this one, I'm going to do the same again. I'm going to do a portion by a floor space. It's just a bit of an FYI for you. If there is something about like cubic volume of the area, it's, again, just apply a bit of logic. The bigger the area, the more it's going to cost me to warm it up. Okay, so for this one, I'm really not blessed with space here, am I? What have we got? £20,000. Okay, so let's write that in. So for this one, 20,000. Now I already know the total floor space, don't I? Divided by 400,000 and then multiplied by the relevant amounts for each department. So I'm just going to put times by an asterisk there. So for our first one, we've already used this information, haven't we? So for cutting, I'd times by 140,000. So if you punch that into your calculator, you should get an answer, thank you, Beverly, of 7,000. And then again, let's move on to the stitching department. So the first part of the formula stays the same. The only difference is I'm now going to multiply by 100,000. Doing that gives me an answer of 5,000, and I'm moving a little bit quicker. I just want to get this last little bit in before we finish for the session, that's all. And then finally, I now know, don't I, that the storage department also takes up some space. So the same formula, just change it to times 160,000. Gives me a total of 8,000. Now, the last little bit I want to do is just looking at the indirect labour. Okay, unfortunately, we don't have time to reapportion tonight. Indirect labour, I want to point that out because I need to allocate that directly. And people sometimes say, okay, well, how do you know that? Short and sweet way of doing it is to just look at what it's actually given me in the budgeted information. So the indirect labour costs, yeah, I've got a total, that's brilliant. But look at it, it's already saying cutting, 10,000, stitching, 12,000, stories, 13,000. What would, I don't need to reapportion this because I already know the costs for each department. If you are given information like this, so if you're told these costs relate to cutting, stitching, stories, canteen, whatever it might be, I don't need to reapportion anything. I can allocate these costs directly because the question is telling me these are the costs for the departments. So it'd simply just be a case of allocating those over. So for the indirect labour, it's 10,000, 12,000, and 13,000 respectively, which agrees with that total of 35,000. Like I said, we have run out of time. I just wanted to point that out before we finished. So let me just press the stop record button and then we'll just do a little bit of a tidy up.